Hello class, we are now in lesson 1.3, Adding Integers, California Standards NS 1.2 and AF 1.3. Remember, everything in red is your title. You need to write that on the top line of your paper. So our objective today is to understand how to add integers and to use properties to simplify the process. You learned this all in 6th grade, so this should just be a review for you. We do have some vocabulary today. We have the additive identity property, the additive identity, which is the number 0, and the additive inverse, which is the opposite of a number. Our rules for adding integers: if the signs are the same, add the absolute values, use the common sign. For example, -3 plus -2 means 3 plus 2, which is 5, and the common sign is negative, so the answer would be -5. If they are different signs, you subtract the absolute values. You learned last year to secretly subtract. Use the sign of the number with the greater absolute value. So it is important here you remember absolute value is always positive. So if they were both positive, you'd take the sign of the number that would be positive, that would be larger. So in the example, -3 plus 2 means you're going to subtract. 3 minus 2 is 1. -3 has the greater absolute value, meaning it would be larger, so your answer is -1. For our properties today, we have the identity property of addition. Think of when you keep your identity, you're staying the same. So the sum of a number and 0, which is the additive identity, is that number. And we summarize that property by saying IDPA, identity property of addition. Make sure you write down all of these properties as well as the examples that you have that to refer to. In this example, we have -3 plus 0 equals -3. The inverse property of addition, if you think of the word inverse, it sounds like reverse, which would mean the opposite. The sum of a number and its opposite, which is the additive inverse, is 0. INPA. In our example, we have 5 plus -5 equals 0. When you add opposites, they cancel out and become 0. We also have the closure property of addition. The sum of two integers is an integer. That simply means if you add two integers together, negative or positive, your answer will also be an integer. It will not be a decimal, it won't be a fraction. Some tricks that you may want to write down, but you don't have to. To simplify your steps, you want to add all the positives together, then all the negatives, and lastly you want to secretly subtract. Okay, so if you've got a bunch of negatives, a bunch of positives, take care of them separately, then you can secretly subtract. Teacher example 1. Pencils down. Use a number line to find the sum. If it says to use a number line, that means you have to use a number line. I can see right away I'm adding a positive and a negative, which means I'm going to be secretly subtracting. So when I take a look at my number line, I start at 0. I add +4, so I'm going to +4. Now I'm adding a negative, so that means I'm going 9 spaces backwards because it's negative, and I end up at -5. And I knew that the answer needed to be negative because that -9 had a greater absolute value. Problem B, -7 plus 8. Again, you're going to start at 0, move backwards to -7, and then you're going to move forwards 8 spaces since it's positive, and you end up at 1. Last problem, -5 plus -2. They're both negative, so you're going to be moving backwards both times. And I think this is cut off on your screen, but you'll see that you're going to end up at -7 because you move 5 spaces backwards and then 2 more backwards or to the left. Okay, student practice 1. Go ahead and copy these problems down. Do them on your own while the video is paused, and when you're ready to see the answers, press play. Okay, let's take a look at our answer for number 1. Again, it says use a number line, so I have to draw a number line. I start at 0, I move forward 11 spaces, backwards 6 spaces, and I end up at 5. Number 2, I start at 0, move backwards 10 places, and forwards 3, and I end up at -7. Number 3, notice I'm moving left or backwards both times, so I'm going to go all the way down until I get to -12. The last one, I'm starting at 0, moving forward 1, and then backwards 1, and I end up at 0. So hopefully you got all those right. If you didn't, correct your answers now. Teacher example 2, find the sum. Now notice this time we don't have to use a number line. However, if it helps you, by all means do so. Okay, so we start with our negative 14 plus 5. We're adding a positive and a negative, so we know we're secretly subtracting. 14 minus 5 we know is 9. And then we want to look at the absolute values. Negative 14 has a greater absolute value, so that means our answer will be 9. And if you want to take, negative 9. If you want to take a look on a number line, this is how it will look. You start at 0, you go backwards 14 spaces, and then you go forwards 5, and you end up at negative 9. Teacher example 3, solve and name the properties used. So here you see I have several different problems. What I want to do is look for properties that I can use. First, notice I combine these two. Because they're opposites, I know they're going to cancel out and become 0 by the inverse property of addition. And again, you can use the acronym instead of writing it out. Okay, now, next I'm going to add that 0 to negative 98 because I know that it's not going to make any difference. It's going to keep its identity. So negative 98 stays negative. And finally, I'm adding a positive and a negative, which means I'm secretly subtracting, and I am using that closure property, and remember that sign of the greater absolute value was negative, so my answer must be negative. Okay, final teacher example. Again, I have a whole bunch of different numbers all through here. Notice it does not ask me to name any properties, so I don't have to write down the properties I'm using, but you may still want to use them. Remember, the trick we learned would be to do all the positives first, then all the negatives, and then secretly subtract. So if I add up my positives, here I've got 50, 20, and 30, which we know is going to be 100. And then I add my negatives, I have negative 12 and negative 24, which you know is going to be negative 36. So here's my positive 100, here's my negative 36, and finally I'm going to secretly subtract the two. And already I know that my answer is going to be positive because that 100 has a greater absolute value. So I end up with an answer of 64. Okay, this is student practice for examples 2 through 4. Please find the sum for each of these problems. Remember, it does not ask you to use any of the properties. However, if you want to use them, if they help you, please do so. Okay, let's take a look at your answers and see how you did. Right here, you're adding two negatives. Your answer is more negative. Here, you can you don't need to use the 0, as we know. By that identity property, you can add it to either one of them. They'll stay the same. And then we're secretly subtracting. We're going to end up with a negative answer because negative 51 has a greater absolute value. Coming down to number 7, we have 2 positives and 2 negatives. So I would add those together first. And then you can secretly subtract them. And notice they're inverse of each other. So they're going to cancel out and become 0. Number 8, again, you're going to add your negatives together, add your positives together, and then we can secretly subtract. We know again that our answer is going to be negative because that negative 756 has the greater absolute value. So go ahead, correct your answers, and then please go on to the quiz.